1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 and 7. Your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast, so that you may be a new, unleavened batch as you really are. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1, Paul tells us that there was sexual immorality among the Corinthian believers, and of a kind that was not even tolerated even among pagans, for a man had his father's wife. The sin was so disgusting even to pagans. Yet the Corinthian believers were misguided. They tolerated the sin. They refused to confront the person with the sin. The Corinthians turned a blind eye to the sin, as if saying that everything is just fine with them, that God is gracious and loving, and it is between the sinner and God. So Paul warns the believers that sin cannot be tolerated in a church setting. The sin of that one unrepentant believer is like yeast, that no matter how small, the yeast will eventually spread and affect the whole batch of dough. In Corinth, the sin of that one person will eventually affect the purity of the entire church, infecting the Corinthian congregation. So what were they to do? In verse 2, Paul says, "If he remains unrepentant, then let him who has done this be removed from among you. The little yeast has to be cut off from the dough." Although Paul is using this analogy of the yeast in a church setting, for it is true that an unrepentant member will infect the spiritual well-being of the entire church, I also, however, believe that this has an application in a smaller setting. The analogy of the yeast can also apply to the individual life of each believer. We are called to be sinless, but we are far from perfection. We were justified from the moment we believed, but the process of our sanctification and purification is a journey that only ends when we are with Jesus in heaven. But the reality is that we will still commit sin, but it doesn't mean that we tolerate the sins that we commit. But we are called to examine ourselves and to see if there is any hidden sin in us that we need to cast out. Like even a small amount of yeast will affect the whole batch of dough, so it is with our sin, that even one sin that is hidden and remains unconfessed can eventually bloom into something bigger. One hidden sin will affect our thinking, and our thinking will affect our behavior, and our behavior will determine our destiny. In verse 7, Paul tells the Corinthian believers to get rid of the old yeast. The old yeast is their old sinful ways and wickedness before they became believers, like pride and malice and envy, and to replace them with purity and love. This too is applicable to us today, and Paul tells us to get rid of our old selves and be the new creation that we are in Jesus. In Exodus 12, God told his people to remove every yeast from their homes in preparation for the Passover. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses. And it has been the tradition of the Jews since then to search through their homes to remove all leaven in preparation for the Passover feast. They make a thorough search of every drawer, cabinet, jar to see if there's even a tiny amount of yeast that is hidden and must be thrown away. So it is in our Christian life. Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1 tells us, "Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles." But sometimes we don't even recognize our own sins because it gives us pleasure. But there is nothing hidden from God, and that is why David in Psalm 139 verses 3 and 4 cried out, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Examine me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Today, let us ask God to search us, to examine our hearts, and remove all the yeast that is hidden in our lives, so that we can be the new creation that we truly are in Christ Jesus. To God be the glory.